Hello, and welcome to Russia Decoded, a podcast of the Center for the National Interest in Washington, D.C. I am your co-host, Andy Kuchins, a senior fellow at the Center for the National Interest and also a adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in D.C. And I am joined by my partner and co-host, Chris Monday, who's back in South Korea. Welcome back home, Chris.
Yes, great to be here in Busan, and we have a lot of interesting information for you today.
Yeah, well, it's been quite a week, obviously. So, we watch the Russian news, so you don't have to. That's kind of our motto. We watch it every day, and in particular, we watch the Vesti Nedeli News of the Week program on Sunday evenings, hosted by Dmitry Kiselev. And we interpret, we analyze, we decode it as to what messages that are being sent to the Russian people, the Russian viewers, which is the foremost audience, but also for the rest of the world. There's a lot of interesting things, messages that are being conveyed, and sometimes some mysteries. At any rate, not surprisingly, the big story this week, Chris, is the U.S. military operation in Iran, Epic Fury, or as Dmitry Kiselev referred to it as the Verolomnaya Napadenia, the treacherous attack. The attack was on the morning of February 28th, Saturday. The news broadcast was on a Sunday evening in Moscow, March 1st, and we are recording our podcast here for you on Monday, March 2nd. The Russian broadcast began with Kremlin.ru, a Kremlin.ru posting by Putin, mourning the death of Iranian leader Ali Khamenei. And Vesti Nedeli notes that former President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad was also killed, as well as the Minister of Defense, the head of the IRGC, and other leading military and security officials. The first day of operations, I think, for the Russians must have hit them as quite a successful first day of decapitation of the regime, something that they strove to do back in February of 2022 and were not successful. And then Vesti Nedeli shows footage of a series of unsuccessful military operations in the Middle East on the part of the United States, starting with Iraq in 2003, Libya in 2011, Afghanistan and Syria. And the implication is, well, it's pretty clear. That is that all of American military interventions in the last 20 plus years have been unsuccessful, but they kind of leave it at that. Then they go to the tragic bombing of the girls' school in Tehran, resulting in over 100 deaths. The attacks on the Gulf states and Israel, raising the specter of a wider war. And then they feature the U.S. embassies in Iraq and Pakistan under siege of violent demonstrators. A bit later in the show, the focus is on Russians, Chinese, and Iranians at the UN expressing their opposition to the use of military force, before the focus turns to the domestic reaction in the United States. Question: what happened to Trump's promise of no more wars? Discussion of splinters in MAGA circles, noting Russian favorite Tucker Carlson. And then channeling opposition from the Democratic Party, they turn to Elizabeth Warren and Tim Kaine, and demonstrations in downtown Washington, D.C., and at Columbia University, mention of a rise in gas prices. And what could this mean for the midterm elections? For me, Chris, the most telling was for Russia was when Kiselev circled back to the question, what does the attack on Iran say about U.S. diplomacy? And then they featured officials from Oman, which had hosted U.S.-Iranian talks just 2 days before the attack, noting that very good progress was being made. I guess if I were to respond to that question, what does the attack say about U.S. diplomacy, is that there are limitations to Donald Trump's patience. Negotiations had gone on with Iran for about 90 days. And I think not only the Russians, but also the Chinese, most of our allies were kept in the dark about exactly what and when would happen. Nobody should be really surprised at what happened, given the gathering of the extraordinary armada of military forces. But still, I think the world has been back-footed by this. And perhaps most telling to me, actually, is the lack of a direct statement by Putin condemning the attack. He seems to be staying out of the limelight. What do you think, Chris?
I can't agree with you more, Andy. There's definitely evidence the Russians were taken by surprise. The attack happened on Russian Saturday, Vesti, and you could just see there they were taken by surprise. There's no real propaganda line, which is very unusual for Vesti. Usually they're told often by the FSB what they're supposed to say, what the general line is. Where here, there's no real certainty. I think Putin is trying to calculate his next move, and Vesti is acting accordingly. They don't want to step in. Today, we saw Trump say, whatever the time is, it's okay, whatever it takes, which of course sounds a lot like Joseph Biden. And
Yeah,
you
it
think
does.
the Russians would make a lot of that, whatever it takes, but they don't. They're standing back. In fact, we have a veteran journalist, Sergei Pashkov, reporting from Israel, and his reports are pro-Israeli. They're sympathetic to the Israeli situation, which again is unusual. And then we see there's no criticism of Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, the other players. Putin doesn't want to burn his bridges or make any hard lines yet in this. That's the main message. For me, of course, they don't say this, but for me, it was clear there's a parallel with the coverage at the beginning of the Ukrainian invasion, Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. I mean, you just couldn't miss it. That was just all of a sudden the bombs going off, people running. For many Russian viewers, there's an uncomfortable parallel. If this is an outrageous act of aggression by America, well, then what does this say about what Putin did in 2022 against Ukraine? Another comparison I'd like to make is with the coverage of the Iraq war in 2002. I was living in
Three,
Russia at the time.
2003.
This was completely different. America was invincible. America was a Superman who couldn't be beaten. And, there was just no question America would just flatten Iraq. Where now there's real uncertainty. Putin's just not clear, not sure what to do. So the takeaways from this, what I got from Vesti, is Putin does not want to alienate Trump yet. He doesn't want overt criticism of Trump. But there was another report later in Vesti Nedelya, very important, by Bogdanov, who's very good, knowledgeable about United States affairs, which shows the fading support for Trump. He's running into political difficulty. Perhaps the Russians think, he might be on his way out or something, impeached. Of course, Russia is signaling that Iran is not our core interest. Later in this podcast, I have to talk about North Korea. It's a very interesting contrast where there North Korea is our partner. But here they're saying clearly we're not going to intervene in this. We're not going to do anything. And then finally, perhaps the most important point is Russia, the Russian minders, the ideologists, they know they cannot stir up any religious conflicts. They don't want to highlight the religious aspect of this. They're scared, of course, of the Russian Muslims getting incensed, going to fight against Israel and not fighting against Ukraine. Several times Russian politicians like Medvedev have had to say that Ukraine is the Iblis, the Muslim Satan, right, and not Israel.
Putin sees that all of the Gulf states have basically sided essentially with the United States because of the attacks that the Iranians have made on their own countries. The great majority of the Muslims in Russia, they're Sunnis, they're not Shia. And yeah, I agree with you that he has to be very careful about upsetting them. I mean, yeah, they may want to go hop on an airplane and go attack Israel. He is sitting on the sidelines, but he doesn't really have any particularly good options. The best option for him is that the United States really gets bogged down here and that it doesn't go as successfully. The parallel with Iraq is interesting in that, yeah, the first month or first 6 weeks of the war in Iraq were spectacular, looked like spectacular success. Then we foolishly decided to make, a land invasion of Iraq and got completely bogged down and made an enormous amount of errors, and it became one of the forever wars. Putin may be hoping that Donald Trump gets caught up in a forever war, but I seriously doubt that Trump will. Any rate, we're going to be talking about this for weeks ahead. Now, earlier in the week, there were two significant landmarks One was on Monday, February 23rd, which was Day of the Defenders of the Fatherland, Dien Защитника Отечества, formerly known as Red Army Day in the Soviet days. This was last Monday, and Putin met formally with the FSB, seemingly at their headquarters, to give essentially a kind of Russia's besieged fortress sort of address. We're surrounded by enemies. They're looking to weaken Russia, especially the fascist Banderovцы terrorists in Ukraine. He's sort of talking like he's making sort of inside jokes with, not inside jokes exactly, but he's sort of talking informally with his people. I mean, these
Yeah.
are the FSB. These are the higher police, the intelligence officers of Russia. He's one of them. And he tries to kind of, I think, create a little bit of camaraderie. But then the next day, which of course is the February 24th, the 4-year anniversary of the special military operation, which was totally ignored on this day and frankly for every day last week until later in the show on Sunday night. But he comes up with this extraordinary allegation, and it starts with the revelations from foreign intelligence, the SVR, that France and Germany have agreed to supply Ukraine with components for the building of a nuclear bomb, not a dirty bomb, but a real nuclear weapon capability. The reporting of this went on all week without providing a shred of evidence. Hearings were held in both houses of parliament, the Federation Council and the Duma. The Russians took their case to the UN. And then Friedrich Merz of Germany also came in for special criticism, despite refusing to participate in the treachery with his French and English allies. Simply knowing about it, he did not do anything to stop it. I think there's more to that. But it all seems a bit like madness, Chris, but there must be a subtext here. My operating hypothesis is that possibly this is all part and parcel of a justification of a major further closing down of Russian society, which has been steadily happening over the last few years. But how do you see it?
Well, Andy, I'd hate to disagree with you here, but I see this, and perhaps it's even hopeful. This is part of Putin's brinkmanship. I think this is part of the negotiations. Putin is trying to establish the post war red lines. What it's basically about is not having long range rockets fly into Russian territory proper. What's not stated, it's very interesting in the Russian news, this was completely cut out. And even in the West, I don't think it was covered enough, was the Ukrainians launched this Flamingo rocket. So this was on February 20, right before, of
Yeah,
course,
they've
done
featured this
for
the flamingo several times.
yeah, for to spoil, the Russian holiday. They flew in the Flamingo, so it's very important. It flew all the way across Russia to this Volkinsk plant. So this is where the Yar. This is very serious. This is where the Yars, nuclear missile, the one you see in the Red Parade. This is where it's produced. I mean, this it's a huge provocation. And Russia, they were scared. This tells us a lot. They were scared to show this at all on the Russian news. Instead, we had Andrei Belousov, Minister of Defense, claimed that they shot down something 500 attack drones. It was very strange. No one's reported about this at all. But this is clearly to cover up this missile launch, which is deeply symbolic. So Putin is trying to reestablish his red lines, saying, we don't want this. And of course, he knows the Europeans will be scared of any talk of a nuclear confrontation or things. Of course, it goes back to a deeper debate in since the beginning of the war about how much Russian territory should be a so-called sanctuary. Behind closed doors, this is debated all the time. Should Westerners allow Ukrainians to use ATACMS or the Tomahawk or JASMs within Russian territory? It's one of the big
Right, but this is
issues.
so I see your point. I take your point, and Russia should be concerned about Ukraine increasing its indigenous capability to produce missiles that can go a long way. The Russians know as well as anybody that a large amount of the Soviet ballistic missiles were produced in Ukraine during the Soviet period. But I don't see why they need to bring up this patently absurd argument about England and France developing or providing for Ukraine a nuclear weapon. That doesn't seem to fit. Although, of course, today, Monday, after this news broadcast we're talking about last week, French President Emmanuel Macron has proposed expanding French nuclear weapons
Umbrella.
capabilities and
Yeah.
providing those for a number of other allies in Europe.
Yes.
It kind of gets to a point that we were making a couple of months ago about Putin. He should beware of what he wishes for
Yes.
in the event of a break between the United States and Europe. There are going to be likely more European powers with nuclear capabilities, and they will all be increasing their defense budgets more. And it could end up really being more of a problem for the Russians than the current relationship.
If I may, Andy, my
Yeah.
take on this is Russia, they want to distract from that Flamingo attack. They can't acknowledge it. This is very important because then Putin would be forced to respond. He's promised to to counterattack, just launch a missile, Reshnik on Germany or France or something. So he really can't. He needs to distract from this. You know, I
But how many
conspiracy.
Russians do you think are actually aware of the test firing of the Flamingo over Russian
Very,
territory?
very few. They've done a very good job of distracting, and then of course with this Iran, this no everyone's forgotten about. It's just forgotten. It'll probably go down the memory hole, Orwell's memory hole. My take on this also was perhaps this was a message to Putin to stay out of the Iranian Iran and things. I think that's what it was about.
I don't
Trying to
think
think
Mr. Putin
briefly.
needs much convincing to stay away from Iran right now. I kind of felt that this message was perhaps tied with the subsequent segment on the new Russian elite. This is, of course, the veterans of the special military operation that Putin began talking about a couple of years ago and founding the program Heroes of Russia, which interestingly enough is the program is managed by Putin's deputy chief of staff, Sergei Kiriyenko, a very, very important and significant political figure himself, a very bright and competent guy, and someone I could imagine possibly being a successor, depending on the conditions. He runs that program, and now the heroes of Russia, and they're genuinely heroes. They've been awarded as a hero of Russia in the special military operation, and they're now getting additional education and training at the Vysshaya Shkola Государственного Управления, the higher school of state education, to fast track them into elite positions in the civil service. So this is kind of an affirmative action program in that national and ethnic minorities of Russia are far more heavily represented in the population of special military operation, military heroes group, and far more of them come from modest socioeconomic backgrounds, which is like Putin himself, underdogs who had to fight hard to achieve their positions. And as one of them, I think who's from Dagestan, is interviewed somewhere in the North Caucasus, he says, I'm just so gratified that I have an opportunity to, contribute back to my country. I think the program and this idea of the new Russian elite and where they're going to be coming from, they are almost 180 degrees to the opposite of kind of more traditional Russian elites, whether they be the wealthy oligarchs or they be the sons and daughters of the elites, the so-called the Zolotaya Молодежь, the golden youth. So I think it's pretty personal for Putin as he considers his legacy, but it's also highly political in that these people are and will be very politically beholden by Putin and his team and in his legacy.
We've written about Anna Tsivalova, Putin's niece, who also helps direct this program. Putin put her in charge because this is absolutely crucial to the regime's survival. This is make or break. This is more important than anything
Well,
else we're talking about.
how you treat your returning crippled and not crippled servicemen.
every Russian knows 1917, the revolution happened because of the problems with the war veterans. They overthrew the regime.
They were armed and
Likewise,
unhappy.
1920s and 1940s, the regimes were established. Nicholas I and Stalin were established because of working with the veterans. But I'd say we can't believe the propaganda here. It's not at all this so far. It's not at all going smoothly. We just don't see many veterans in top posts. They're not running the companies or running the factories or becoming key ministers. So far, we don't see them in the elite, and it's gonna be tough. A lot of these guys, we see doctored images. We don't see the actual veterans, and they're mangled, and they've been a lot. We're already coming from prison or something. I mean, it is gonna be a tough road.
Yeah,
It,
I
it's
I completely agree with you
I would also like to
about that.
point
This
out
is
that
kind of a myth that they're creating
yes,
around
yes.
these guys.
I'd also like to point out this report was done by Podubny, a veteran journalist. He was actually in
Yes.
Kursk during the invasion. He was wounded. You can see the scars on his face. This is a tough man, and it's very strange seeing him with a Kirienka in some uniform. It's a very strange juxtaposition.
I think it's the first
And the
time I've
rumor
seen Kirienka in a uniform, actually.
Okay. Anyway, I thought it was a bit strange, but the rumor mill says that Podubny, Sivalova, and Lavrov will all join the United Russia Party and form this kind of ticket, and they'll be Putin might step aside or move to the back, and these will be the leading political figures, kind of like in 1999 we saw this Shoigu and then unknown Putin with Karelin.
They've been talking about this possibility now for more than one generation.
Yes.
And
Yes. It
and
never
there's
happens.
still Vladimir there at the top. But speaking of
Yeah.
significant political figures in Putin's circle, Mikhail Mishustin, the prime minister, got a really strong plug in the news this week, I thought, in his presentation of the annual government report to the Duma. He really put on a very commanding performance, and which he was resoundingly complimented by Gennady Zyuganov of the Communists, of Sergei Mironov of Just Russia, of United Russia, all of the so-called fractions. He is a commanding guy, and that he's very on top of his portfolio, his facts and his figures. He is polite, and because there was some criticism as well, but not from really the leaders. He's another person that we've written before and talked about. And of course, if Putin were to be hit by a bus tomorrow, then Mikhail Mishustin would be the acting president for the next at least 90 days until when they would have to hold elections. Why don't you elaborate, Chris?
It was a very interesting report. Of course, in the 90s, Gennady Zyuganov was crucial to taking down these prime ministers. Like, for example, Kirienka. I don't think it's by chance we saw them kind of juxtaposed again. People remember this, how powerful a figure Zyuganov was in taking down Yeltsin's prime ministers. Where here they make a show of him supporting Mishustin. Also, we see the far right and very anti-Semitic site Zavtra, run by Prokhanov, also praising Mishustin, who's Jewish.
The late Prahanov. He
Yes,
did pass, but the website
yeah,
lives on.
yes, yes. Unfortunately, what I see here is, of course, this is another propaganda piece. There is growing criticism, and people are upset about what's going on in the economy. People are being pinched, and so they're doing a show, trying to make it look like there's unity when there's not. And we do see overt criticism of someone where there's a certain amount of criticism is allowed. This is Olivera Nabiulina, who runs the interest rate and the
She
exchange
runs the
rate.
Russian she runs the Russian central bank.
People are upset. There was a prediction earlier this week that the ruble would go over 100 rubles to a dollar. The exchange rate would basically kind of crash. And perhaps this is needed as more technical, but of course, Russia gets its revenue from oil, and if the exchange rate is high, well, then they can finance
Well,
the poor
Russia's
people.
about to experience a bit of a windfall with the rise in the oil price. I thought
Yes, that's what's
there
in
were
it.
a number of interesting shots of Nibulina there in the rafters with other government members, kind of smiling wryly. She knows what's going on, and why people are on the high with high interest rates. But that's just the nature of the job of running a central bank. Let's turn to definitely a story for you, Chris, especially now that you're back in South Korea. There was a long segment on North Korea, starting with Kim Jong Un being recoronated at the Ninth Party Congress in Pyongyang. Now, I know you're eager to say a lot about North Korea, but it's,
No,
try
no.
to try to restrain yourself a little bit.
It's a topic I love. We haven't heard much from North Korea, so it's a very important segment. And what I got is they're not really talking about North Korea. What they're saying, in the report they call them a druzya, right? Druzya. This is a drug. So in Russian, a drug, this is someone who helps you in a time of need, right? Someone who helps you in a time of need. And then they showed again the North Koreans in Kursk. What I took, they don't say this, of course, but what I took is Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, Iran. They did not send troops to Kursk. They did not help us in a time of need. They're not our friends. They're not Druzhya. They're just, partners or strategic geopolitical, pawns or figures, and we don't have to help them. It's okay what Trump's doing. We can stand back. That's the main message I got.
You're
Sure.
absolutely right in that, the Russians and the North Koreans, they have a mutual defense treaty. It's with
Yep.
security guarantees for both sides. So they're in a totally different category from the other states that you mentioned.
They're justifying this on the news. They're showing that Kim Jong Un he sacrificed his people to help. Of course, this is a lie, but to help the Russians. It's pure-hearted. They recycle some old footage that's interesting for if you're a Korean expert. It's very interesting. We see, for example, if I could just mention one thing, propaganda tents where the Koreans have to supposedly North Koreans have to go every day and listen to indoctrination lectures every hour. But in reality, we know that I've heard I have students here, Russians. They talk to North Koreans all the time. They see them all the time now in Russian. They have phones. They're watching South Korean dramas. It's not at all like this. And so Kim Jong Un, he's going to have some problems sending his troops abroad. That was one of my takeaways.
There's a lot of footage of the Korean soldiers training and with their shirts off, and they're incredibly fit and they're incredibly quick, but they're just training in the Kursk forest. They are never shown actually doing any fighting on the front or, in theater. Even when they were in theater, that's never shown. We're getting to the last couple of stories, and one of them I found pretty interesting. It was the Исторический кружок, the historical circle. That's one thing I think we both like about Vesti and Jelly, is that there's so much history that they reach back to. This episode, the topic was Winston Churchill's famous speech at Fulton, Missouri, the Iron Curtain speech, which the 80th anniversary is coming up in just a few days this week on March 5th. It prefaces the speech with a report about Churchill's idea for attacking the USSR in 1945, Operation Unthinkable. Dear old Winnie was thinking about it, and they show some maps from it. Kisilov's emphasis here was that essentially Churchill deceived Stalin by calling for the Anglophone
Yeah,
anti-Soviet alliance, a precursor for NATO, and the Cold War, and it refers to it as Durachnichestvo, which translates as foolishness, but I think
yeah,
it has a harder edge
Durak.
in Russian. This is really a fool's errand. He's being an
Yeah,
idiot. I kind of took this as a warning to Trump not to similarly deceive Putin. Otherwise, he will deeply regret it.
If I could, Andy, I completely agree with you. That's an excellent point. And also, I would mention on Solovyov's talk show, we saw him saying we can't trust Trump. He could backstab us. He's unpredictable. We said at the beginning, they're trying not to attack Trump directly, but behind the scenes, we're definitely seeing talk of, I think this is honest. People are saying to Putin, we can't really trust him. He's too unpredictable, and he could backstab us. Like before. If I could just quickly mention, you know how I love history. In it's the Soviet interpretation, the Americans, especially Allen Dulles, were trying to make side deals with the Nazis. This is a huge plot of the thriller. Every Russian knows this.
Right.
17 Moments of Spring. This is the main plot. In the Russian mind, yeah, the Americans are very devious, and they could even have made a side deal, with Hitler. And I agree with you. This is a subtle criticism of Trump.
Putin realizes this so well. I mean, his favorite show was
Sure.
17 Moments of Spring,
Yes.
as it was for so many Soviet citizens when it came out. And it's cut this line, I think, of, just Trump turned on the Iranians during the diplomatic negotiations. It kind of runs a bit through the broadcast in the beginning.
Yeah.
Now, finally, a segment on one of our favorites in Putin's circle, Alina Maratnovna Kabayeva. Alina Kabayeva, another ideal figure for Russia's new elite. She was featured this week in her capacity as the head of the rhythmic dancing club Sky Grace, which placed first in a competition in Russia this week. Now, a little bit more on Kabayeva. We'll get to the part that she is the main squeeze of Vladimir Putin, but let me just preface that by saying she was born in Uzbekistan in 1983 to seemingly an Uzbek father and a Russian mother. She gained fame as literally one of the most decorated rhythmic dancers in history. She garnered a gold medal in 2004 in the Athens Games and also a bronze medal in Sydney in 2000. She's a winner of 14 World Championship medals, 24 European Championship medals. I mean, she had an extraordinarily successful career. After she retired, she served as a deputy to the Duma from 2007 to 2014. And then in 2014, she joined the National Media Group and got very wealthy along the way. And yes, I think it's more than a rumor that it's a very well known, but not so publicized fact that she is the main squeeze of Vladimir Putin. I don't think Girlfriend quite captures it. And she's reportedly the mother of his two sons, Ivan, born in 2015, and Vladimir Jr., born in 2019. We have seen a photo of Ivan, purportedly a photo of Ivan. And I got to say,
Yeah.
this kid looks just like Vladimir Putin.
Just
If
like
it's not
yeah.
Vladimir Putin's kid, then this is a clone they've made up. Now, Wikipedia has her starting her relationship with Vladimir around 2000 when she was 17. I have no idea if that
Yeah.
is credible. But, she does kind of fit the mold of, someone who, she's not coming from an elite family. She's coming from Uzbekistan and
Yeah.
she's coming from a mixed marriage. And she has risen to the top on her own abilities. And and she does present very, very well. And she is quite attractive. So, Chris, why don't you talk a little bit about how you see her significance in Russia today? I mean, who is she to the Russians? To Russians?
Well, Andy, I have a little controversial take. I think she's becoming a key behind the scenes player. Russians really poo poo this, but I think there's some evidence. So there was opposition candidate Boris Nemtsov. At one time,
Oh, yeah.
Yeltsin tapped him to become president of the Russian Federation. I mean, this is a major figure. This was the first time I really took Kabayeva seriously. This was on Echo Moskvy. I can't remember the exact date. He brought up, Putin's not really so holy as we think. He's with Kabayeva. This was the first time it was really mentioned in, public discourse. And after that, he was humiliated. They put him in prison where he had to stand, for days. And then I think this was this was directly related or perhaps planned by Kabayeva. Nemtsov was killed in 2015 walking in Moscow with a young model who would have been about the age of
Well,
Kabayeva.
they were actually having dinner, I think, outdoors, and they got
Yes.
gunned down,
Yeah, I
literally right
mean,
next to the
well,
Kremlin.
he did. She's still alive. Veritskaya,
Oh,
she's
sorry.
still around.
Yeah.
But I mean, this was a carefully calculated, staged revenge. I think perhaps by her to show, well, here you are. Here's, you're criticizing me, and look at you. You're doing the same thing. I mean, that this was really staged, and of course to pull this off, they had to have inside, you had to have people who knew Nemtsov intimately who could have planned this whole thing out. I mean, just think about this. I mean, this really
Well,
sinister thing.
Boris was an old friend of mine. He was a great guy, extremely talented and gifted, but boy, did he have something for the young ladies.
I don't have proof, but I'm pretty sure that Kabayeva was this was part of this for
Well,
sure.
it's an interesting hypothesis, but I just let me finish off on this part of your point about, I guess our point about the emerging new elites, and we've mentioned a couple of them, a couple of females now: Anna Putina-Sibylyova, Alina Kabaeva, and then there's of course Putin's two daughters by his legal wife, Maria and
Ludmilla, yeah.
Katya,
Yeah.
who have stepped out a bit into the limelight and in quite impressive ways. All right, I think we need to wrap up, Chris, and that.
If I could mention though, Kabayeva, she's now head of a media empire.
Yes,
She
I mentioned that.
produced
Yeah,
a film, Krasny Shulk, Red Silk. It was a lavish production with China.
yeah,
And
we talked
so,
about that back in December.
yeah, she's becoming a player, as is Putin's daughter. These are serious figures.
So, dogs that did not bark. I don't know. There weren't something didn't really jump out at me. I mean, I guess mine is pretty much the no mention of U.S. Russia or trilateral U.S. Russia Ukrainian negotiations on the war, which has been a central feature of Vesti Nedeli and Vesti, going back to the Trump Putin summit in Anchorage last August. Part of this is likely due to Iran, and perhaps also that the Kremlin is really waiting to see how Iran plays out, to see whether they should recalibrate their strategy with the United States, as we were alluding to before. I thought I had another dog, as there was no mention all week of the 4-year anniversary of the special military operation. And I remember saying last week in our broadcast that, well, if there were no mention of the 4-year anniversary of the special military operation, then that would be a dog that did not bark. But then in the 93rd minute of the Vestina Daily broadcast, Kiselyov did finally mention it, and he pointed out, how badly things have gone for Europe and how great things are going for Russia. So I guess, unfortunately, the dog barked. How about you, Chris?
It was odd though. It was
Yeah.
a very meek defense of this war,
It was.
special operation.
It didn't sound like he had his heart in it, really.
No. And then
It was like he
it
was kinda
came at the
checking
end.
the box.
It came in the middle somewhere, and
Yeah,
then
93 minutes. I mean, who's still watching then besides us?
yeah, yeah. I would not count out, someone's watching our podcast and they put that in somewhere. But anyway, I have two quick ones. A veteran Korea watcher, Andrei Lankov, who's well known and well regarded in the West and here in Southeast Bates in South Korea. He was detained and blacklisted in Latvia. And this was not, it was very curious. Usually you'd see this on the Russian news, they're attacking our people and, Russophobia. But for whatever reason, I didn't see anything about this on Vesti or in the main Russian sites, although everyday Russians are talking
But
about
that's odd. Do you
it's
have a
news number
hypothesis
one.
as to why this dog did not bark? What do you think?
Frankly, I'm not. I was wondering what you thought, but I'm not quite sure. I think they don't want to show Russians how badly relations have gotten. I mean, if they could do this to one Colt, then this could happen to anyone. Perhaps that's the reason. If I could mention just quickly, another news item is Chechen businessman and former senator Umar Jabrailov. Supposedly he committed suicide. I think it's strange. I guess he was 67. He was found, with a gunshot wound to his head. But what's interesting for me, he's a very colorful figure from the 90s, involved in these shady deals and things. But what's interesting for me, of course, was he is a friend of Epstein, and he was prominent in the files. And so perhaps Russians, someone didn't want him back in the news.
He's also tied to, of course, the late Paul Tatum, who was I think, a co-owner, if not the majority owner, of the Radisson Slavyanskaya Hotel that first opened in 1993. And I stayed there a lot when I was
Oh wow.
in Moscow until they built the Marriotts, which were a little bit of a step up. He was gunned down and reputedly by Chechens. Anyway, I would imagine there were a lot of people that had it out for Jabrailov. What's surprising that is he hasn't been taken out before this week. Or maybe he did just commit suicide. I don't know. A couple of
We'll
mysteries.
probably never know.
We'll probably never know. That's right. All right. It's time for us to wrap up. Thanks so much, Chris. Very lively and interesting session. I hope all of our listeners enjoyed, and we thank you for listening. We're hoping to develop some ways to communicate directly with our audience, make this a little bit more interactive, but that is yet to come to fruition, but we're working on it. Thanks finally to our producer in Washington, Jordan Henry, who makes us sound better than we are. So, all right, Chris, good to see you,
That's
and
wonderful.
we'll see you next week. Bye bye.